and welcome to PFAS in drinking water and the new Massachusetts drinking water regulations. Today's presentation is presented by MassDEP Drinking Water Program, and it's hosted by RCAP Solutions. Like I said, hosted by RCAP Solutions. RCAP Solutions is part of a nationwide network called RCAP, which stands for Rural Community Assistance Partnership. RCAP works with all 50 states, plus Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. My name is Rebecca Novak. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be your host today. I'm in Massachusetts. I work with RCAP's Solutions Network. It's going to be all the purple states on the map there. So New York, the New England states, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We are a nonprofit company providing training and technical assistance to rural communities, transient non-community systems, and tribes on drinking water and wastewater issues. We also offer a lot of training sessions, which often earn credits, like today, for water and wastewater operators. Each network has a regional office, and we'll all report to one national office, which keeps us collaborating effectively. Our work is funded by federal grants like USDA, HHS, EPA, and also state grants. I just need to acknowledge that this training has been funded wholly or in part by the United States EPA agency. The contents of this session do not necessarily reflect the views and policies of the EPA, nor does the EPA endorse trade names or recommend the use of commercial products mentioned in this session. So let's talk about how we're going to earn our TCHs, or our credits. So in order to earn credits today for attending the session, you must attend the whole session, or as much as 90% of it or so. Participate in at least 75% of the polls and tests, meaning give us an answer. You can give us a chat box if you're having problems selecting it when they pop up. And also complete an evaluation that's going to show after the session has ended. That evaluation is also going to be sent in a follow-up email. So you'll receive your certificate after you complete all those things in about 2 weeks. I'm going to pass the presentation now over to Margaret.
Can you hear me okay, Rebecca?
I can hear you, Margaret.
Okay.
And I'm making you a presenter.
I don't see the option to share my screen.
Yep, you are sharing your screen.
Oh, okay, you can see it?
Yep.
All right. Oh, okay.
There you
go. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for coming to our training on PFAS and the new regulations. As Rebecca said, you could write your questions and comments in the chat box, and we'll leave time to go over them at the end. My name is Margaret Finn. I work for DEP. I'm the PFAS lead in the Boston office. This is today's agenda. I'm going to quickly explain to you what PFAS are, their history, use, and health effects. And many of you are familiar already with PFAS. They've been in the news a lot, and you've probably heard a lot from DEP about the requirements for sampling. Bill will introduce the regulations, and Lydia's going to talk about compliance. And then we have some special guests to tell you what's going on in the department with PFAS, in addition to the drinking water program. And we have some poll questions and quizzes throughout the training, and we're going to have a 5-minute break in the middle. So we're going to start with the first poll question.
Margaret, will you read the question just in case somebody is having trouble seeing the poll that they can answer in the chat box?
Okay, it says, for public water supply employees, has your drinking water been tested for PFAS already? And the choices are yes, no, unknown, or not applicable.
We're going to give everyone about 5 more seconds and then shut the poll down. So get your answers in. And 64% of people said yes. 16% unknown, 16% said no.
Great, a lot of people have already tested. Let's start with what are PFAS? PFAS are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're a family of thousands of compounds. They're extremely stable, heat and stain resistant. They're called forever chemicals because they're very persistent in the environment and they don't biodegrade. I've also heard them referred to as everyday toxins because they are ubiquitous in our environment. You could find them in air, water, soil, and they travel easily in water, which is unfortunate. They get into groundwater and they move. Common uses of PFAS. They're used in manufacturing and industrial processes and in a lot of consumer products. They're in textile, leather treatments on your carpets and furniture. They're used in waterproof down fabrics and rain jackets. They're in paper coatings because they're grease resistant, so they're used on food packaging. They're in waxes for floors and car and skis. And one of the biggest sources we have found so far in Massachusetts is the aqueous film forming foam that is used by firefighters. There are 2 kinds of aqueous film forming foam. There's a Class A foams, which are principally used in wildfires and structural fires. And then there's Class B foams that contain PFAS, and they're designed to be used where a fire might involve flammable liquids. There are numerous pathways that PFAS can get into our environment through our food, drinking water, the firefighting foam, as I said, and consumer products. They get into the air from factories. They get in the air also from municipal trash incinerators, because PFAS can only be destroyed at very high temperatures, and not all municipal trash incinerators are burning at a high enough temperature. Wastewater treatment plants can eject them into our surface water supplies if that's what they're disposing of their effluent. This is a map. We have this up on our webpage of where we've found PFAS so far at public water suppliers, and there's 30 of them already, unfortunately. And where we found them, as I said, was where it's firefighting foam was used at airport runways or training areas, or where a fire was put out, where there have been fire trucks washed in parking lots and the foam got into the ground. And as I said, there are other possible ways they can get into a public water supplier from landfills or biosolids that come from wastewater that is used as fertilizer and spread as a fertilizer onto farmland or parks. Now we're going to talk about how we measure PFAS. PFAS is measured at parts per trillion, which is a very small amount. And the maximum contaminant level that we set is 20 parts per trillion, and it's for the sum of 6 of these PFAS compounds. And Bill and Lydia will talk about that later in the regulation presentation. The parts per trillion is 1 drop in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. That means our standard of 20 parts per trillion is 1 drop in 1 pool. And that may seem like a very, very small amount, but even a part per trillion can have an effect in your bloodstream. there are chemicals already in our bloodstream that have effects on our bodies, and these are ones that our bodies produce: estradiol in women, insulin in adults, and human growth hormone is measured in parts per trillion in our bloodstreams. Now, we also need to consider that if you find parts per trillion in drinking water, it bioaccumulates in our body. So we're measuring it at parts per billion in people's bloodstreams. And that's not to say that we are sure that if you've been exposed to PFAS at parts per billion, that you're going to have health effects, because the other chemicals in our bloodstreams that are naturally produced, estradiol and insulin, we know what those do, but PFAS is an evolving science, and the health effects are just being learned. So the question is, why focus on drinking water? Most of our PFAS contamination, it turns out, comes from food, from fish, especially for adults, milk products for toddlers. But for infants, most of their PFAS exposure comes from drinking water. And if somebody's drinking contaminated water, the drinking water can account for up to 75% of their total PFAS exposure. Now we're going to talk about the potential health impacts. Because PFAS bioaccumulates, it's readily absorbed into the body. It accumulates primarily in the blood, serum, kidney, and liver, and it's slowly excreted from the body. The half-life can be 1 to 8 years. And another way we know that it accumulates in your blood is that the people with the lowest PFAS levels in their blood are people who donate blood and menstruating women. The health effects associated with PFAS are on the liver, blood, immune system, endocrine disruption from thyroid hormones, and developmental risks to fetus and infants. It's also been associated with possible cancers. And the concern about the immune system, especially since we're all going to be vaccinated for COVID soon, is that your response to vaccinations, it has to do with your immune system, and we want to have strong immune systems. And consuming water with PFAS above the drinking water standard doesn't mean, as I said, that adverse health effects will occur. The degree of risk depends on the level of exposure and the duration of exposure. And our 20 part per trillion value is set for a healthy adult and the lifetime consuming of that water. But there is a risk from shorter term exposures for sensitive subgroups, and that can be in weeks or months. And these are the sensitive subgroups: pregnant women, nursing mothers, infants, and people who are immune compromised. And the way we determined our PFAS drinking water standards is through our office and research standards. They review current studies, data, and assessments. We've looked at other state and government standards, and we convened a health effects advisory committee from professionals and from academics. And we included stakeholder involvement throughout, consumer groups and industry. And the science of PFAS is rapidly evolving. So even in our regulations, it requires our Office of Research and Standards to re-review all the scientific data every 3 years and assess our standard. This is the history of how PFAS has been regulated. It was invented in 1938, and it was widely used in the 1950s going forward. And between 2000 and 2002, one of the PFAS compounds, Pfos, was voluntary phased out of production in the US by its primary manufacturer. And then in 2006, EPA 8 major US companies to commit to the elimination of their production and use of PFOA by the end of 2015. And that doesn't mean it was out of the environment in 2015. Certainly, overseas companies were still using it and are still importing it into the US. But the CDC has measured a drop in the blood levels of PFOS and PFOA in the residents of the US. The regulation of PFAS started with a provisional health guideline issued by the EPA in 2009, and that was at the level of 200 parts per trillion for PFAS and 400 parts per trillion for PFOA. And then EPA required many public water suppliers to monitor for PFAS during 2013 to 2015 under the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. Then in 2016, based on new research, EPA lowered its drinking water health advisory to 70 parts per trillion, and that was for the sum of those two PFAS compounds. Health advisories are non-enforceable. They're non-regulatory, and they provide technical information to state agencies and public health officials. Then MassDEP issued an Office of Research and Standards guideline for the sum of 5 PFAS compounds in 2018. We added 3 more PFAS compounds to that guideline because they're very structurally similar to PFAS and PFOA, so very likely have the same health effects. In 2019, we lowered the guideline to 20 parts per trillion, and we added 1 more PFAS contaminant to the sum. And then this October, we issued our regulations establishing a maximum contaminant level of 20 parts per trillion for the 6 PFAS sum. And this is a comparison of our standard to other states. We're very similar to Vermont in our maximum contaminant level. They're doing 20 parts per trillion for the sum of 5. Other states are setting an MCL for each individual PFAS compound, like New York, New Jersey, Michigan. The standards are sort of all over the place at this point. The ones up on our screen have set maximum contaminant levels. Other states have issued guidelines or notification levels, and a lot of states are waiting for EPA. They're simply using EPA's guideline value of 70 parts per trillion for the sum of the two. And here is our first quiz. Oh, and the question is, how many PFAS compounds are known to exist? The possible choices are a few, a dozen, hundreds, or thousands.
Okay, looks like we have about 80% of you voted. Let's give them 5 more seconds and then we will shut the poll down. %6 said a few, 13% said a dozen, 31% said hundreds, and 51% said thousands.
Well, the 51% got it right. There are actually thousands of compounds in this family of compounds. And Rebecca, did you want to do questions now?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me go to my chat box. Did you want to
just advance the screen just one more. That way people just have that reminder to answer right there, chat box. Yeah. Okay. Then we're not thinking about the question here. And I believe there's only one question for you.
Okay.
Margaret, are there any updates in free PFAS lab analyses programs?
Yeah, later on in the program, we're going to talk about our free analysis. We're offering a free PFAS sampling to all public water suppliers. We have a bunch who signed up who are required to start in April, so we'll get you your sampling box in March. And anybody else who wants to sign up, who isn't signed up, who is a public water supplier and not a consecutive system, can sign up. We'll give you the web link later.
Okay, I think that's it for questions.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to Bill Schwartz then.
Yep, our next presenter is Bill Schwartz, and Bill, I'm making you presenter right now. Thank you, Margaret.
All right, can everyone see my screen?
Not yet. I believe you just need to click. Did you click the yes or accept? There we go.
Okay.
It might have just been my internet. We're good, Bill.
Okay. So there's my first slide. Okay, good morning. My name is Bill Schwartz. I'm here today to go over some of the basics of the regulations and what's required of PWSs. I've been with MassDEP for 2 years. I am the PFAS lead in the Southeast region. And prior to working at DEP, I was a drinking water operator for the city of Taunton. Before I go into my presentation, I just want to let everyone know that all the information used in today's, or what I'm presenting today, can be found at the MassDEP website. There you can find the PFAS regulation word for word, an easy to follow regulation quick reference guide, a field sampling guide, a how-to video on PFAS sampling, as well as a monitoring flowchart. All these materials and links will be provided at the end of the presentation. I just wanted to point this out because it's a valuable resource that I use on a daily basis when dealing with this regulation. And because this is new regulation, I'm still learning and gaining knowledge as I go through different experiences and situations. As a result, there will be times today where I'm just reading from the slides as I present, and I just ask that you bear with me. I'm just trying to make sure that I present the information clearly and accurately. The last comment I want to make before I start is that after the presentation, when you have any questions or concerns regarding the regulation and what is required, the best thing to do is to reach out to the PFAS lead in your local regional office. We're all committed to working with each PWS to assist with the implementation of the regulation. All right, as Margaret discussed, the regulation establishes an MCL of 0.0002 milligrams per liter, or 20 nanograms per liter, which is most commonly referred to as parts per trillion, for the sum of 6 PFAS compounds. The regulation outlines that monitoring requirements for PWSs will be rolled out over time according to the population served and the type of PWS. The regulation also requires community and non-transient, non-community PWSs to take action if the sum of the PFAS 6 is above the MCL. For transient non-community water systems, the regulations requires that they collect 1 PFAS sample. However, they are not subject to the PFAS 6 MCL. Instead, for TNCs with PFAS detections above the MCL, the MassDEP Office of Research and Standards will perform a site-specific health risk assessment for consumers at these locations. As I stated in the previous slide, COMS and NTNCs need to take action if the sum of the PFAS 6 is above the MCL. These actions include public education, public notification, and to work towards lowering PFAS levels. Examples of ways to lower PFAS levels include installing treatment, blending source water, and when possible, removing sources from operation. Also, as required with other detects in finished water, PWSs must report any PFAS detections in the CCR, not just the PFAS 6, and health language must be included if the MCL is exceeded. Oops, I'm sorry. Throughout Mass, either through the UCMR, voluntary or targeted sampling, many PWSs have already taken action to lower PFAS levels below 20 and notified its customers that PFAS was detected in the drinking water and the possible health risks. As I mentioned, the monitoring requirements and sample start dates for PWSs are being rolled out over time based on population and the type of PWS. The regulation requires COMs and NTNCs to complete or perform initial monitoring. Initial monitoring is 4 consecutive quarterly samples to be collected from all finished water entry points. The regulation also specifies that samples must be collected in the first month of each quarter. This is an important part of the regulation, and so I'm just going to repeat it and make it clear that the required quarterly samples must be collected in the first month of each quarter. The initial monitoring start dates for COMs and NTNCs are as follows. COMs and NTNCs that serve greater than or equal to 50,000 need to begin January 1st, 2021. That's already happened. COMs and NTNCs that serve less than 50,000 but greater than 10,000 begin April 1st. And COMs and NTNCs that serve less than or equal to 10,000 begin sampling October 1st, 2021. As I stated, the regulation does not require TNCs to conduct initial monitoring. However, it does require 1 sample to be collected by September 30th, 2022. For seasonal PWS not in operation during the start date, they must commence sampling after the start of operations. And one thing I want to make clear is that seasonal TNCs need to be aware that the regulation requires the sample to be collected by September 30th, 2022, and that is a hard date. If a seasonal TNC operates in the winter months and does not typically begin operations prior to September, they should consider collecting, or they should collect samples prior to the season of operations in order to comply with the deadline. My first poll here is, have you included funding for PFAS monitoring in your yearly budget? So the options are yes, no, unknown, or not applicable.
Just a reminder, if anyone has trouble answering the question, you can always write the answer in the chat box. But it looks like the polls are working pretty good today. Looks like most of you answered. We'll give 5 more seconds and then we will close it down. And 42% said yes, 25% said no, 24% said unknown, and 9% said not applicable.
So I would just take a moment here to plug the free analysis. If you haven't budgeted for it, or if you're not prepared for it, to reach out to us so we can set you up with the free analysis. So the next, I'll be going over the sampling and analytical requirements outlined in the regulation. As Margaret explained, PFAS is commonly found in consumer products and equipment. This, along with the very low reporting limits, means that special care must be taken when collecting PFAS samples, such as wearing nitrile gloves and requiring a field reagent blank. The drinking water operator or person collecting the sample also needs to be aware of the surroundings and have proper sampling technique to reduce the risk of cross-contamination. You can find a field sampling guide and a how-to video on the MassDEP website that explains what to be aware of and how to correctly sample. These links will be provided in a follow-up course materials email. They can also be found by a simple internet search. I know there's been a lot of concern about the possibility of cross-contamination when sampling. However, it is my opinion that drinking water operators collect various samples on a routine basis, and depending on what is being sampled for, each sample collection may have its own specific process or steps or techniques to correctly sample. An example is that LCR needs to be a first draw, or when collecting VOCs, THMs, and HAAs, the sample bottle needs to be full with no air gaps. And when you collect bacteria samples, you prep the fixture with a hyperwipe. PFAS is no different, or is not different, and the person sampling needs to be aware of the concerns of technique when collecting the samples. The regulation requires labs to be certified by MassDEP, and they must use an EPA approved method. Labs that are not approved can subcontract to approved labs. The regulation also requires that the labs be able to achieve a minimum reporting level, or MRL, of 2.0 parts per trillion or less, and requires the results to be submitted using DEP. However, currently, the update to EDEP software is still under construction, and PFAS results are unable to be accepted through DEP, but is expected to be ready soon. Even though the PFAS results cannot be currently submitted through DEP, I do want to take a moment to remind and ask PWSs that do not submit other sampling results through EDP that they consider to start using EDP for those submissions. In the long term, it makes it easier for all. It puts the data in electronic format that can be stored, and they can easily be retrieved. The current process for submitting results is to submit them to your local regional office. When the lab has completed the analysis and provides you with the results, it will include a full detailed lab report. The full lab report provided by the lab is required to be submitted along with the results. And I'm just going to repeat that because we do have a state form, but currently, without the use of EDEP, we're requiring that the lab reports be submitted with the results so that the staff can perform a proper review of the data. This slide is a sheet or page pulled from an individual lab report, and I want to go over it, understanding it and interpreting the results. Starting at the top left, you have the parameter column of the individual PFAS compounds that were analyzed. Next, you have a column for the results, the qualifier column, the units column, a column for the reporting limit, or MRL, and a column for the minimum detection limit. When reviewing the lab report and totaling for PFAS 6, you first need to make sure you identify the correct 6 compounds. If you look at the first compound at the top of this slide, it's PFBS, which is not one of the PFAS 6. In this slide, I have starred the correct 6 compounds. Another important item is in the lab report is the qualifier column. If you look at the lab sheet, I have circled the J value qualifiers. A J value is an estimated value less than the MRL, but greater than the MDL that the lab calculates according to the method. The lab will include this estimated J value in the report, but J values are not included in the sum of the total PFAS 6. That wasn't the case previously, and I just want to repeat that moving forward, J values are not included in the summation of the PFAS 6. When I spoke about what is required when sampling, I discussed the use of a field reagent blank or an FRB when collecting samples. FRB or field reagent blanks are used when collecting samples to determine if a PFAS detection in the drinking water sample may have been a result of cross-contamination during sample collection. The thought is that if PFAS is detected in the field reagent blank, then the sample may have also been contaminated, then the drinking water sample may have also been contaminated when the sample was collected. This slide is a lab sheet of the analysis of the field reagent blank, and as you can see, the result column is all ND or non-detect. If any of the PFAS are detected in the field reagent blank, the sample will be considered invalid and another sample will need to be collected. For a field reagent blank to be considered non-detect, the lab result must be below 1/3 the MRL. An example of this is below. The PFOA is detected in the field reagent blank at 1.3. 1.3 is greater than 1/3 of the MRL. Therefore, the field reagent blank is not a non-detect, and the corresponding drinking water sample would be rejected and trigger resampling. Next, I'm going to go into the specifics of calculating the PFAS 6 total. The regulation outlines that when comparing the PFAS 6 total to the MCL, the sum of the PFAS 6 needs to be rounded to 2 significant figures. This means that you round to 2 significant figures after adding up the PFAS 6 results, including all digits reported in the lab report. This slide is an example. If you look at this slide, this is the table found on the MassDEP PFAS reporting form. The lab reported a result of 4.69 for PFOS and 4.46 for PFOA. The other results were all 0. When surmising these results, as I stated earlier, when surmising these, the sum of the results is 9.15, which when rounded to 2 significant figures would be 9.2. Just above the table, we have another example of rounding to 2 significant figures, and I point out this example because it is very close to the MCL of 20. The sum of the PFAS 6 is 20.50, which rounds to 21. And the sum of 20.49 rounds to 20, which does not exceed the MCL. Next, I will discuss the quality of the data being provided by the lab. The lab method has a 30% margin of error, which is similar to other drinking water analysis. The sensitivity for detecting PFAS has improved since the UCMR3 testing, and MassDEP is working with labs to ensure all necessary quality control elements are being reported And with the assistance of UMass, we are completing extensive QA/QC analysis of all PFAS results. Okay, next I have a quiz. The question is, care must be taken when collecting PFAS samples in drinking water because the potential or the possible questions are, there is a potential because there is a potential for cross-contamination from consumer products, the PFAS will volatilize and escape into the air, or samples must be kept warm.
Okay. We got most of the votes in. We'll give people about 5 more seconds to get their answers in. And 97% of people said potential for cross-contamination from common products.
That's good. We got that answer. Sorry there, I was muted for a second. All right, next are the monitoring requirements outlined by the regulation. Monitoring sample locations. The regulation requires PWSs to sample all finished water entry point locations where the water enters the distribution system. PWSs that draw from more than one source, which combine before distribution, must collect samples that are representative of all such combined sources during normal operations. If all the sources are not operated simultaneously under normal operations, then additional samples shall be collected representing each source when operated. And consecutive systems are exempt from conducting compliance monitoring for PFAS for the purchased portion of water, provided that the PWS from which the water is obtained meets the PFAS 6 MCO. Okay, next I'm going to discuss initial monitoring again. As I explained earlier, the regulation requires COMS and NTNCs to complete initial monitoring, and initial monitoring consists of 4 consecutive quarterly samples, and requires these quarterly samples to be collected the first month of each quarter. That's in January, April, July, and October, and the start dates are dependent on the population served by the PWS. PWSs will receive a revised sample schedule prior to their start date, and the regulation allows for PWSs to substitute existing or prior PFAS results for up to 4 quarters of the initial monitoring. For results to be substituted, PWS must request the substitution prior to start date, and the lab reports must be submitted, and they must pass current QA/QC requirements. To substitute these results, you should contact the PFAS lead in your regional office. There is also a waiver that can be requested during initial monitoring. For results from the first 2 quarters at locations that are non-detect, a PWS may request to waive the 3rd and 4th quarters of the initial monitoring. This is location specific, and a PWS may have some entry points that are non-detect and others with detections. The waiver would only be granted to locations with non-detects. PFAS detections. A PFAS detection is defined as any PFAS contaminant greater than the MRL, not just the PFAS 6 that is in the regulation or outlined in the regulation. And the initial detection of any PFAS, not just the 6, must be confirmed. When confirmatory samples are needed, confirmatory samples are required after the initial detection of any PFAS 6, after the initial detection of any PFAS, not just the PFAS 6. And the confirmatory samples are also required after the first detection of PFAS 6 greater than 10 parts per trillion at previous locations that had results less than 10. An example of this would be if a PWS is in the third quarter of sampling and all previous results are below 10, but the third quarter results are over 10, it would need to be confirmed. This confirmation is required because, as I will explain shortly, confirmed results greater than 10 may require increased monitoring. The confirmatory samples must be collected as soon as possible after the receipt of the initial results and no later than 14 days unless granted an extension. Once a PWS has collected a confirmatory sample, a confirmatory average will be determined using the two results. The confirmatory average of the PFAS 6, if the confirmatory average of the PFAS 6 is less than 10, the PWS will continue initial quarterly monitoring, collecting the next sample the next first month of the quarter. If the confirmatory average is between 10 and 20, the PWS must increase monitoring at this location and begin monthly monitoring until the location is determined to be reliably and consistently below the MCL. And I will discuss reliably and consistently below in the upcoming slide. If the confirmed result is greater than 20, the PWS must provide public education to its customers and begin monthly monitoring at this location. This slide is a table of examples when sample locations may need to go to increased monitoring. Like I explained, if the confirmed PFAS 6 level is between 10 and 20 or over 10, monthly monitoring may be required until the location is determined to be reliably consistently below the MCL. If the confirmed result is over 20, increased monitoring will be required. Increased monitoring may also be required if a PWS is blending water to achieve levels below 20. And the last example is when a PWS installs treatment or has existing treatment that is removing PFAS from the source water. Okay, reliably and consistently below the MCL. The definition in the regulation states that reliably and consistently below the MCL means that though a system detects contamination in its water supply, it has knowledge of the source or the extent of the contamination to predict that the MCL would not be exceeded in the future. For this determination to be made, DEP will evaluate and consider the variability of the data and if it is sufficient and it does require professional judgment. There is not a specific value used to determine reliably and consistently below the MCL, but generally maintaining results less than 10 parts per trillion is considered reliably and consistently below. Routine monitoring. The regulation outlines routine monitoring frequency. After a PWS has completed the initial monitoring requirement, The results will be used to determine the frequency of sampling required during routine monitoring. If the initial monitoring results are all non-detect, the PWS will monitor 1 year for each subsequent 3-year compliance period. PWS is serving more than 3,300 would collect 2 quarterly samples in that year, and PWS is serving less than 3,300 would collect 1 sample during that year. If PFAS 6 is detected at greater than 10 during routine monitoring, the detect must be confirmed, and it may lead to increased monitoring requirements at this location. PWSs will be able to apply for monitoring waivers starting in 2023. Monitoring waivers after January 1st, 2023, a PWS on routine monitoring may request a waiver from MassDEP. The waiver covers a 3-year compliance period, and waivers must be renewed each compliance period. Sampling frequency under a waiver would be at least once during a 3-year compliance period of each successive 9-year compliance cycle. For the PWS to maintain the waiver, detects must be reliably and consistently below the MCL, and if PFAS 6 is detected at greater than 10 during the monitoring under this waiver, the detect must be confirmed, and it may lead to increased monitoring at this location. Next, this slide is a copy of the PFAS monitoring flowchart that can be found on our website. It outlines the paths I discussed from initial monitoring, detections, confirmatory average, routine monitoring, and waivers. I'm not going to go step by step through this flow chart because it is a little complex, and there are some variation, or I should say there are some situations that would need to be explained a little bit further. I mean, it's a thorough flow chart, but it's a little difficult for me to explain. But I did want to share it to you because it is a valuable resource to look at to get an idea of what the next steps may be for you as a PWS. Next, I have some commonly asked questions that I would like to, and answers that I'd like to go through. The first question is, what if PFAS, what if a PWS has just begun monitoring and finds PFAS 6 less than or equal to 10? The answer to that is a PFAS needs to confirm any initial detection. If confirmed less than 10, they would continue quarterly monitoring as per the initial monitoring requirements, which would be the next sample the first month of the next quarter. Second question is, if PFAS 6 is over 20, does the lab need to notify the PWS within 24 hours? The answer is the lab must notify PWS of any single result over the MCO within 24 hours. Next question, if a PWS takes a source with results greater than 20 offline before they can collect a confirmatory sample, do they still have to send public education materials? The answer is, while the PWS will not technically trigger the requirement if they took the source offline before a confirmatory sample could be collected. However, they will have to present these results and information in the CCR, so a voluntary PE would often be the best choice for providing timely information to the customers and being transparent. Question 4, if a system is on routine monitoring and they have a PFAS detection less than 10, do they have to collect a confirmatory sample each time they report a detection? And the answer is no. Confirmatory sampling is only for an initial detection and initial or routine monitoring or an initial routine monitoring detection over 10 for the first time. Next, if a system must sample monthly, quarterly because of a PFAS detection at only one of its entry points, do they have to sample all entry points at this frequency? The answer is no. The monitoring requirements are based off each individual entry point. Okay, next is questions. If you have any questions, you can write them in the chat box.
Okay, we've got a list already. Keep them come in if you have them. We'll just go take them in a row. We have sampled last year. Do we need to sample again?
So I don't know the specifics of the PWS, depending on your population and what the detect was, when you would be required to sample again. I don't know if you're an NTNC or a TNC or a COM. So I can't give a specific answer to that without knowing the specifics of the PWS.
Okay.
If you want to email me or the local PFAS lead in your region, we can get you that answer.
Okay, next question. Is PFAS, PFAS, a general name for PFOS, PFOS, and PFOA and others?
Yes, PFAS is an umbrella for all polyfluoroalkyl substances, so it includes every compound.
I apologize if this is a repeat of the question before. It might be a little different. Is the DEP going to offer free testing for small systems?
Yes. Every PWS, small or large, is available to take advantage of the free analysis. It will be provided at the end of this, and it's found on online or in the P directory emails that people receive. There's a link to sign up for the free PFAS analysis. If you sign up for that and you don't hear anything back, I would just follow up with the local PFAS lead.
Okay, are consecutive water systems required to do PFAS monitoring?
Not for the water that they purchase. They are required to sample their own sources, their own entry points. For the water that they purchase, the providing PWS, as long as they meet the PFAS 6 guidelines and MCO, there's no requirement to sample for it.
Are MWRA communities required to test at each entry point, even though the MWRA tests for PFAS at the source?
So I believe that's the same question I just answered. If they're consecutive and they're purchasing from MWRA, they do not need to sample, or they're not required to sample. MWRA is required to sample the water that they're selling or providing.
Okay, result turnovers from the lab has taken 4 weeks. Repeat samples cannot be taken in compliance with this within this turnover time. Will MassDEP recognize this lab issue for compliance with the first month testing?
So I believe I don't want to speak for the entire department. We're aware that this has happened, and we're working with PWSs. I think as long as the best effort is made, there's no compliance issues. If you're negligent, there would be a compliance issue. But we understand that right now the lab's getting a lot of samples. It's a new regulation. And so there is a hard date in the reg, but we're working with PWSs to accommodate that.
Do we need to report the J values on our CCR? If so, why?
You do not need to report the J values. The J values are considered a non-detect, and I believe that's correct. Maybe
Agreed.
later, Margaret, or Lydia can chime in on that. But I believe that's correct. J values are considered a non-detect. They're not reportable in the CCR. It would only be values, other values.
Do we have to continue sampling when PFAS are not detected?
So depending on the PWS, what type of PWS and where you fit into the regulation, if you are a COM or an NTNC, you need to complete initial monitoring, which is 4 consecutive quarters. So one initial non-detect does not get you through the initial monitoring. You need to complete the 4 consecutive quarters. The situation where one sample of non-detect would be fine is a TNC. And so if you have, like I said, I'm doing my best to answer these. If you have specific questions, just please reach out to either me in an email or the local PFAS lead.
Why has Massachusetts set an MCL of 6 PFAS of 6 PFAS at 20 parts per trillion, while other states, except Vermont, are setting higher thresholds, and the EPA has a standard of 70 parts per trillion?
So I don't know that I can answer that thoroughly. I would just say that I believe that our Office of ORSG has determined the health risk of that of 20 being the health risk to the sensitive subgroups.
If a PWS collects a sample less than 10 parts per trillion, do they need to collect a confirmation sample?
Yes, and it's a confirmation sample is needed for any PFAS compound that is detected not over the MRL, not just the PFAS 6. So if it's for FBS, which was one of the compounds I talked about, which is not part of the PFAS 6, if there's a detect in it, it needs to be confirmed.
Just lost my spot. Can you just confirm, are we testing for PFAS 6 or all other PFAS compounds?
This is a good question, and I'm glad it was asked. What is required is that all compounds that can be analyzed for in the method be reported and analyzed for. So it is not just the 6 that you need to analyze for or report. You need to analyze for all compounds that are supported in the method, and they all need to be reported.
So the first time you test, if you get under anything other than a non-detect, then you have to do a confirmation retest.
That is correct.
There's a question here, how do we remove PFAS in a treatment plant?
So there's some approved methods. It's mostly adding some sort of carbon to absorb the PFAS. There's also some resins. And so it is, installing treatment to remove it.
Okay.
I like answering questions better than presenting. So.
Okay, there is a lot more. Lydia, let me know if I should keep going or not. Is DEP going to a PFAS 8 with 20 nanograms per liter in the future?
I'm not gonna say no. I'm not gonna say yes. I think there's gonna be a constant evaluation of what poses a health risk. But currently, right now, it's the 6. I don't see any immediate change, but I'm not gonna say there would never be a change.
Okay. There is more questions, but I just want to keep us all on schedule. We'll get to them at the end if there's time. But for now, let's take a 5-minute break, everyone. I think we need to stretch our legs, do a little yoga, use the bathroom, fill your coffee cup, and we'll come back around 10:18. I'm going to start the timer. I'll see you guys back in 5 minutes. Don't worry, I see a couple comments saying you have a blank screen and a timer, and that's it. That's not a problem. We're just in between presenters right now. I stop the timer, ready to go when you are, Lydia.
Hey, oh, before we start, could I do one last comment?
Absolutely.
All right. So something that's come up that it may be later in the presentation, I'm a little unsure. I just wanted to clarify, when there is a detect at an entry point that is fed by multiple sources. So if you have, 4 or 5 wells going into one entry point and you get a detection at that entry point, we do require that the raw water, each raw water source be sampled and analyzed for PFAS so that it can be determined, the corresponding result or amount that each well is contributing to the overall detection. That's something that's been coming up with me while I'm working day to day, and I just wanted to explain that because there are a lot of PWSs that have multiple sources feeding an entry point. So that's it.
Thanks so much, Bill. My name is Lydia Thompson. I'm a MassDEP pre-PFAS sampling program project coordinator. I was previously a risk assessor in the MassDEP Office of Research and Standards. And I want to put in another plug for those regional PFAS leads before I start, because folks like Bill are some of the hardest working folks I know, and they are really good about helping out public water suppliers with questions around these regulations. We're all getting to know them better by the day as we look at each new situation, and they're very helpful folks. We have their emails towards the end of the presentation, and they will be part of the materials you'll see afterwards as well. Is everybody seeing this slide that says data now?
Yep, they
Yes.
are. Thanks.
Very good. All right. So I'm going to thank Bill also for taking the really hard parts. From here on out, it gets a little simpler. I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that we are using on the PFAS, and I'm going to start by introducing Andrew Durham. He's our Drinking Water Program EDP lead, and he's going to walk you through some of the steps that public water suppliers can take to see their results online through EDP.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Lydia. Yeah. Good morning. My name is Andrew Durham. For those who don't know me, many of you do. I am the data manager in the DEP Drinking Water Boston office. Today, I'm going to focus on what is the future PFAS reporting through EDEP. And fortunately, we haven't got it up and running yet, but we expect it sometime in February. EDEP is used, as many of you have used it for your ASR, the Annual Statistical Report. Yes, so this slide is out of date. The paper reports, it said EDEP in mid-December. We're looking at probably 3rd or 4th week in February for the new EDEP upload for certified laboratories. So let me see, I didn't have that slide. So what we're going to do is look at the EDEP system and how you as a public water supply can view your EDEP results on, or your PFAS results on EDEP, the process that moves the data through the QA/QC and also moves it to the Eea Data Portal where the public and or yourselves can retrieve the information. So currently this is the paper form that is used for reporting PFAS results to the DEP. It is similar to the other paper reports that are available. The little twist here is that PFAS is required to be reported through EDEP once the EDEP system is running. So this form essentially will be retired and results will not be accepted on the paper form once the EDEP is up and running. Next slide, please. This is a list of the QA/QC that PFAS requires the laboratory to provide to the state. It's a checklist for our staff to look at during the QA/QC review of your data when it comes in. PFAS is unique in that we go further in depth, even though a lot of the other analysis have these extra QA/QCs, such as the field blanks, fortified blanks, field fortified, lab fortified blanks, and surrogate information. Since PFAS is new, since the detection limits and the reporting limits are so low, the prevalence of contamination, we want to make sure the results are valid, so it goes through an extensive QA/QC review. So on EDEP, we expanded some of the fields, and that's what we're working through now. It also requires the laboratory to attach a paper, or essentially a electronic PDF of the paper QA/QC, and it's a manual review when it comes to the DEP. Next slide, please. So the data, once it passes through EDP, comes into the system. It's held for a quality control check that is a manual process. Right now, the DEP is contracted with UMass and several staff for them to perform this check to determine if the data is usable and reliable. The PWS will get an email when the data has been approved, and it may trigger a resampling if the detection is above the 10 parts per trillion. The data will move into WQTS, which is our data system. And from the WQTS database, it moves onto the Eea Data Portal the next night. So it's available the next day. And the data portal displays all of the water quality data that's in WQTS to the public. It's also available to the public water suppliers if you want to retrieve PFAS or any of your other water quality data. So, EDEP reporting for PFAS. For the water supplier to view their certified lab reported water quality data, it requires an EDEP account, and that EDEP account needs to have a public water supply proof, which is the security for you to either fill out an ASR or to see any EDEP reported water quality data that is related to the PWS ID that you use during the proof application process. So these are two little screenshots.
You still there, Andrew? I don't hear you.
Yeah, I think you muted yourself, Andrew.
Andrew, can you hear us?
Requires you to go to the proof of identity feature under my profile, and you click on apply for a proof, and there's two options for the water suppliers. It's a PW certified operator proof or the responsible party proof. The certified operator proof is for currently certified operators. We had envisioned that there would be some forms that only operators could fill out. We have not built those out yet. hopefully in the future we will be able to. One thing during the proof application process is the TIN. It's the tax identification number. So do not put a social security number in there, please. And the TIN feature is another sharing feature between EDP accounts. If you don't have a TIN, if you can't find your tax identification number, or if you don't want to use your tax identification number because let's say you're the in a town, if you put in a tax identification number that's also used by, let's say, the Conservation Commission, you may start seeing all the conservation notices of intent for the town on your account, and you may not want to see those. So you can make up a fictitious 9-character TIN and the system will accept it, but it has to be unique. Otherwise, you may start seeing, if you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, probably someone else has used that, and you will start seeing their work on EDP. So unfortunately, this is a shared service, and it's a required field. Next slide, please. So when you get to that first page, you click on apply for the proof. It's going to ask you for a certified operator license number if you are applying for the certified operator, or for both the certified operator and the responsible party proofs, you need to enter in one PWS ID number, or you can enter in multiple. So if you're an operator that is contract operating multiple TNCs, let's say, you can put in multiple PWS IDs, and you will see all the lab uploaded water quality data for all those TNCs. Next slide, please. So once you have your proofed account and a lab has uploaded and reported water quality data, it will show up on your work in progress tab if the lab has not signed or submitted it yet. So in this case, the lab has uploaded the data, but they have not gone through the complete process of signing and submitting it. The feature here is that it allows you to review a report prior to the DEP staff seeing it. So at this point, DEP staff cannot review or see any work in progress transactions. It's synonymous to a lab sending you the paper report prior to mailing it into DEP. Some labs go ahead and sign and submit their work right off the bat. They upload it, they sign and submit it, so they don't give you the option. If you want this option, you need to contact your certified lab and have them hold the sign and submit steps prior to you verifying it's acceptable. Let's say the sample location's wrong or something you're not comfortable with. The lab can delete the transaction and start over. Next slide, please. This is an example of what you would see. This is the PDF report. And as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, it is unsigned. So that means DEP staff have not seen it. It is not an official report. It is just a draft report. This is an example that is a work in progress. It does not have the MRL in it. But that's the last piece I'm working on actually today, is to spiff up this report. Next slide, please. Once the lab has signed and submitted any water quality data, including PFAS, it will show up under your recent submitted tab. So when you log into EDEP, you see these tabs: the work in progress, recent submitted, archive submitted. That is very old. In order for us to save space on the server, we needed to sort of store these things in an archive. So it's not actually retrieving every single report every time you log on. But it's probably 2-year-old data. I think I'm not sure how it actually archives it, but it will. The data will never go away. So these reports will remain on EDEP forever, meaning forever? Well, we'll see. But it meets EPA's record retention requirements, meets DEP record retention requirements. You do not need to print them. You do not need to have them in a filing cabinet. This is your filing cabinet for these water quality data. And if you click on the DW Bulk Data tab, next slide, please, you will see that the report, same PDF report, but in the upper right-hand corner, now it is submitted and signed. So this means it's an official record. It's an official public record. If there's an error found at this point, it's not the end of the world. You would need to contact DEP staff so they can reject this transaction, reject this report, and the lab can replace it with the corrected report. Next slide, please. So when you're contacting DEP in such a situation, it's important that you have the EDEP transaction ID. This is the ID for this one transaction, so the DEP staff can find the report with an error and either reject it, correct it, or when you're referencing EDEP transactions, that ID is critical to both of us looking at the same information. Next slide, please. The Eea Data Portal. Looks like the URL at the top of the page here is a little blacked out. The easiest way, and whenever I go to Eea Data Portal, I use a search engine like Google, type in Massachusetts Eea Data Portal, or just type in Eea Data Portal. It always pops up as the first link. And what you do is either go down to the Eea environmental data sets, pick drinking water, or up in the right-hand top bar, search data. Drinking water is one of the options there. Click on drinking water. Next slide, please. And it will bring you to a search screen that's not shown here. Search screen is pretty straightforward. You can search on PWS ID, PWS name, town, class, the contaminant group. So in this, oh, we did have that, sorry. So this is the search screen. You enter in a PWS ID and PFAS and the collected date, and that last screen again, Lydia. This screen I didn't bring up just the one PWS ID, but it shows you the grid for the PFAS reports. And on that grid, there's an option to drill in to the details on the left. There's also, and this is an example of the detail page. It shows you the one analyte, PFOS in this case. It includes the result qualifiers, reporting limits, detection limits, date collected, the detailed information. Also off the grid, there is an option for exporting to Excel. You can export that information which you searched for in an Excel format. It only goes up to 65,000 records or so. So if you look for all the water quality data for a large public water supply, you may bring back more than 65,000 records. That export to Excel button will disappear when the amount of records is higher than the limit of Microsoft Excel. But it's a good way for you to pull all the information you need from your water supply or just limited information. Next slide, please. All right, so this is it. Andrew Durham at mass.gov. Contact me for EDEP accounts, for proofing questions or proofing assistance. You can email the program director and it will be forwarded to me. And the EDEP directions for setting up an account and a proof, I believe, are in the training materials for this. If not, just send me a email. So I'm ready for questions. Are there any questions in the chat box?
There is. Can you clarify what ASR stands for, please?
ASR, the Annual Statistical Report. So every water supplier is required to fill out an ASR, an annual statistical report. The primary use of that is to collect the water volumes used in the last year. It also gives the water supplier an opportunity to update things like certified operator, affiliations, who's the primary, who's the secondary, and other information that is editable on that report. The report is pre-populated from our database, but it has blank fields for the water volumes, etc.
With a 30% accuracy rate, a 9 could result in a value of 7.5 to 10.5. Is that correct?
Yes, it could. And that is not just for PFAS. It's the same surrogate recovery rate that is used for VOCs, SOCs, THMs, HA5s, is essentially this industry standard across the board. And that is how confirmation samples are used. Because when you get into doing repeat analysis and confirmations, it really brings it into whether it's there or not, and very close to the actual levels.
Will the PWS be specifically notified of what resampling is needed through EDEP, or will it just tell us that it's over 10 parts per trillion?
EDEP will just show you the report. Any actions taken, any actions required, that correspondence comes through the DEP regional offices, and it would be typically for the regional PFAS coordinators to follow up with the water supply on any follow-up actions. Although public water suppliers are required to know the regulations and know what they need to do. So this is always a tricky situation. You know, the water suppliers are required to know the regulations, are required to know the follow-up actions, such as if you exceed the MCL, there's public notification, there's other actions, take it offline. Same thing as with E. coli contamination in a boiler.
Okay, just to confirm, if data is in EDEP, we do not need to have a hard copy available at our office, correct?
Correct.
What is J value?
J value is a result qualifier. So the labs run an analysis of perfectly clean water to determine what the method detection limit is. That detection limit is under extreme ideal situations, and it tells them what they're seeing in that sample is not actually a background noise for the instrument. The method reporting limit, which is higher than the method detection limit, is the reporting limit. So that is the limit that a lab feels comfortable reporting a value for. That's typically higher. Any value, any reading coming off the machine that is less than that reporting limit, but higher than that detection limit, is qualified with a J value. So let's say your detection limit is 1, but your reporting limit that you're comfortable reporting at is 2, but the instrument comes back with a 1.5 for this sample. The lab will report that 1.5, but they'll put a J next to that, that value, because it's in between the MDL and the MRL. And it's there, they're confident there's something there, but they're not confident 100% in that number. And it's important information for us to have and make compliance determinations on, but that's what a J value is used for.
Who is the MassDEP Northeast Region PFAS coordinator?
That's Amy La Pusada. We have the names and addresses towards the end of the presentation.
On the last slide, though, they'll be there. I have tested and had to repeat samples, but there was confusion with DEP and UMass on the repeat samples, and now I am doing a third round, but only one site out of 3. That's not a question, I'm sorry. Unless you have something to say about that.
No.
Okay, I'm reading these as they come in, so.
Yeah, that sounds more like it's a, communication and make sure that you're taking samples where you should be and confirmation samples, etc.
Labs in Massachusetts are not required to report directly to the EDEP at the moment. Is that correct?
They will be for PFAS. It is actually in the regulation. It is optional for all the other reporting done except for the lead in schools assistance program. Hopefully, sometime in the future, we will get 100% EDP reporting because it makes it, we find it makes it much more efficient and easy on all involved, the laboratories, the public water suppliers, and DEP. But we haven't pulled that trigger yet because of various regions and reasons and etc.
Okay, Andrew, and that's it for questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Please contact me if you have questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. Now that Andrew has gone through how you can see some of this data, I'm going to go and talk a little bit more about what happens with the data, especially when it starts being around that MCL. And as Bill mentioned, the MCL applies to community water systems and non-transient, non-community systems. So that 20 nanogram per liter number applies to those systems. It does not apply to the transient non-community water systems. That's your restaurants and your recreational areas, your campgrounds, those really small systems. As Bill mentioned, they have to collect 1 sample by September 30th, 2022, I believe. And if it's over that 20, they would have a site-specific health assessment from the Office of Research and Standards. The MCL does not apply. So once folks have some data, let's take a look at how the compliance calculations are done and how a violation is calculated. So the compliance with the MCL is calculated using the average of 3 monthly samples over 1 calendar quarter, which is why, as Bill kept on saying, the first sample has to be in that first month of the calendar quarter. That way, if PFAS 6 is detected greater than 20, more samples can be taken. If any single sample result would cause the quarterly average to exceed the PFAS MCL, then the public water supplier is in violation. For example, if your first month sample comes back and PFAS 6 is greater than 60 nanograms per liter or parts per trillion, that would be considered an MCL violation right away, because even if the next 2 monthly samples were lower, the quarterly average would still be above 20 parts per trillion. If any sampling location is in violation for a public water supply, then the public water supply is considered to be in violation, and that becomes important when I get down to the public education and public notice information. And just to go back to what Bill emphasized and emphasize it once more, 20.49 rounds to 20, 20.50 rounds to 21. And that, again, is important when looking at the MCL and doing a comparison. So here's an example of a public water supply with 3 months, a full quarter worth of data. And you can see that the concentration from their first sample was 21 nanograms per liter. They could then confirmed that. They got 22 nanograms per liter. The average of those two is 21.5. They took 2 more months worth of samples. The average of those quarterly samples is 20.466. And as we just went over again, that rounds down to 20 so that they would not be in violation of the MCL. When an MCL is violated, that of course will be notified by the MassDEP with an enforcement action of some kind, usually an NON, and that NON would require the public water supplier to issue public notice and submit their long-term corrective action plans. The corrective action plan would have a timeline for correcting the levels, and the corrective action plans are not required for TNCs unless the individualized ORS health risk assessment would determine otherwise, that corrective action plan was needed. So what do those corrective actions look like in the short term? Margaret mentioned some of these, I think, earlier. It could be just turning off a source of water that is high when there are other sources available. It could be blending waters to get that water that is delivered to be below 20 parts per trillion. Or it could be purchasing water from another public water supply that has water that is below the MCL. Long-term corrective actions could include installing treatment. Bill mentioned that there's granulated activated carbon, there's some resin treatments that are being used in the state. It could also be shutting off wells that were high, blending the water, looking for new sources of well water that are below that 20 nanograms per liter, and purchasing from another public water supply that has water that is below the MCL. And here are some pictures of GAC canisters. In addition to that GAC and the ion exchange resin, there is nanofiltration and reverse osmosis. However, those both produce reject water, which would currently be high in PFAS, and there's no good solutions for how to dispose of that water. So the first two options are the ones that we have seen in Massachusetts. All right, and so once there is water with PFAS 6 confirmed greater than 20, there are some outreach to the public that needs to happen. The first of those is public education. So the first confirmed result in finished water greater than 20 parts per trillion triggers PE. So that would usually not be an MCL violation yet. Of course, we just went over that that's usually from a 3-month average. Of course, it might be an MCL violation if, in fact, it was over 60. That's the caveat there. But usually, if there's a result greater than 20, that first month's confirmed result then leads to public education. This is a really short time frame, and that time frame is there to help those sensitive subgroups that Margaret mentioned earlier. A lot of those sensitive subgroups could have short-term exposure concerns, pregnant women, infants, and so it gives those sensitive subgroups information quickly, and that way they can react quickly in deciding to drink bottled water. The public water supplier must be providing those public education materials. There's a template available from MassDEP. It's similar to a public notice that way. And those public education materials must be delivered as soon as possible, but within 30 days of the confirmed results. Delivery methods look similar to public notification as well. Social media, web posting, hand direct delivery, conspicuous locations posted in say a facility if it's an NTNC. Reverse 911 can be very helpful, email, radio, but they must be mailed unless MassDEP approves an alternative delivery method. Those other methods can be a great way to serve in addition to mail, to get the information out there quickly, to get it to people who might not get delivery of mail, things like that. So here's an example of the public education template. You can see that it includes information about the public water supplier, the PFAS results, a little more information about the systems for a system where perhaps one entry point is above the MCL and others are not. It says which of those entry points are not above the MCL. There's standard health effects language, and this I believe is in the regulations as well. And then it goes on to a section about what should I do, and you'll note it says consumers in a sensitive subgroup, and it mentions those pregnant and nursing women, infants, and people diagnosed by their healthcare provider to have compromised immune systems. are advised not to consume the water. So that's the important piece of the public education as far as getting the information out to those sensitive subgroups. And then it includes steps to reduce exposure for non-sensitive subgroups. It notes that the 20 nanogram per liter value is applicable for a lifetime in consuming water for those who are not in the sensitive subgroups. But if folks want to take action, it lists some possibilities there. There are translation requirements. These should also look very familiar if a system has translation requirements for their consumer confidence report. These are the same requirements. And there's a link there to the language translation requirements. It's the same place that you would go for your consumer confidence report, as you can see. So most systems that would have a translation requirement for their public education would be familiar with that from their consumer confidence report. Public education materials must be updated quarterly until the source is taken offline or is below the MCL. And that, again, lets those who have a short time frame for their exposures to take action quickly. Then in a more familiar with all the other contaminants, there's public notice required, and that again would come with an enforcement action of some kind, usually an NON. There's a template again provided by MassDEP, and then of course other monitoring and testing procedure violations are tier 3 public notice, as like other contaminants. So here again is the public notice template, and you can see it looks quite similar to the public education template. It goes through what happened. For now, there's a paragraph noting that it's a new regulation. It has a table for showing the results, includes that required health effects language, has information on what the consumer needs to do, on what the public water supplier is doing, and some links to fact sheets and things like that. So in those consumer confidence reports that I was mentioning, because the similar translation requirements, a PWS is required to report any detection of any PFAS in its consumer confidence report. And as someone asked earlier, would a J value count? No, those low J values are not considered detections. Detections are above the MRL. And if PFAS 6 is detected over the MCL, then the consumer confidence report must also include the potential adverse health effects language, which looks very similar to the language in the PN. There's templates for the CCR language, and it looks like this. If the PFAS 6 was over 20, you can see that it includes possible sources of PFAS and that health effects language. And here's a template for reporting the non-PFAS 6 PFAS. If those are detected, like PFBS, above the MRL, that's a detection, must be included in the CCR, though there's no information for possible sources and health effects. It's an unregulated contaminant. All right, so moving on from possibilities when there are elevated levels, taking a look at how PFAS might affect the new source approval process. So if one is looking to develop a new well, say, and looking at the PFAS 6, if there's PFAS 6 in a test well between 10 and 20 nanograms per liter parts per trillion, the public water supplier will be advised that there's a risk in proceeding to develop that source, of course. In some past situations, the drinking water program has required a public water supplier to have an escrow account and a plan for future treatment, if that might be required, if it's seeming like the PFAS may be elevated in that well. Those new source approval lab results come in as PDF email reports, so they're not submitted through EDEP like the usual final approved wells would have. Once, of course, a source has been approved through the new source approval process, it would be added to the databases, and it would be assigned a DEP location ID, and then results would come in via EDEP, but not until it is an actual approved source. So new source approval if there is in fact PFAS 6 in a well above the MCL. This would, of course, would depend on the concentration of the PFAS that are detected, whether or not the likely source of contamination is known and being cleaned up, what other options the public water supplier has as far as purchasing water from another public water supplier, adding treatment and things like that. The capacity that that public water supply has for addressing the contamination is treatment an easy option there for that well. And I should note that any new source or added treatment will then trigger the lead and copper rule for some simultaneous compliance. And so you would just need to keep in mind the lead and copper rule requirements, things like this benchtop test, or switching back to a standard monitoring frequency if treatment or a new source are added. If non-PFAS 6 PFAS are detected, things like that PFBS or GenX, in a potential new source, MassDEP's Office of Research and Standards may be asked to do a health assessment of the water and see if those, what it might mean that those other chemicals are found in a drinking water source. And this is similar with all other emerging contaminants in accordance with the regs. All right, so that gets us through most of the drinking water portion of the regulations. I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the other bureaus at MassDEP are doing about PFAS. The Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup added standards in December 2019, which are for water are the same as the drinking water standard. And they also have soil standards that were added. The wastewater program has been doing research to increase monitoring requirements, hopefully through EPA's NPDES permits and MassDEP's surface water discharge permits. And they've been coordinating with the Office of Technical Assistance to help any industrial dischargers upstream of a public water supply be identified, test their water, and reduce PFAS use if there is any. And then the Bureau of Water Resources has also been working on residuals in sewage sludge and items like that to collect data and increase the data collection requirements to have PFAS be part of the contaminants that are being tested for in any of that sludge that is then land applied to farms or parks. There's also a study going on through MassDEP with the United States Geological Survey, looking at rivers throughout Massachusetts and looking for ambient PFAS levels in surface waters. And they have included monitoring both upstream and downstream of wastewater discharges to see if they have effects on the rivers. MassDEP has had a successful AFFF firefighting foam take-back program, which has collected more than 200,000 pounds of those foams that do contain PFAS for proper disposal, so that there aren't those sort of reserves of PFAS out in the community that would then be a problem if they were to be released. And the Massachusetts Department of Public Health regulates bottled water. In 2019, there was a program with voluntary monitoring by bottled water bottlers and bulk suppliers, and a system where they had sanitary surveys conducted for those that made ice and sold bottled water. And now that there is a drinking water standard, the Department of Public Health requires all bottlers who sell water in Massachusetts to sample for PFAS as well. Folks have mentioned the free PFAS analysis program for public water supplies. We've had a good number, I think more than 300 public water supplies have signed up and been at least started testing through that program. Every public water supplier is entitled to at least one free round of PFAS sampling. If there's confirmatory sampling or resamples needed due to QC, those are also included. Those funds are currently available until June 30th, 2021. We're hoping they'll get extended, but for those smallest systems that don't have to begin sampling until October, they might want to keep an eye out to see if there's any news about whether that free sampling needs to be done before June 30th in order to be funded by MassDEP. There's the link for signing up. It also is in all those P-Director emails that Bill mentioned, and it will be in some of the materials that go out after class. And I do want to note that if a public water supply signs up for the free sampling and PFAS 6 is detected at greater than 10 parts per trillion, they may in fact need to go on to monthly monitoring and begin implementing the MCL in order to address that PFAS 6 that is discovered. In addition to the public water supplier free PFAS sampling program, there's also a program for private wells. MassDEP has prioritized 83 towns that are mostly served by private wells to invite private well owners to have their wells tested for PFAS. Working with the towns and the boards of health and some of our regional partners, we're currently sending out postcard invitations to private well owners. We have a process whereby we create a map and try to include private well owners near potential sources of PFAS, such as landfills, but also get some distribution throughout the town as well. From those, we hope to select about 20 to 40 private wells for the free sampling program. Thus far, we will need to do some more outreach to get more private wells to sign up. And like the public water supplier side, if confirmation sampling is required or resamples, that is part of the free sampling project as well. And now I would like to introduce Mwra from our Bureau of Municipal Services to talk a little bit about the State Revolving Fund and some of the resources they have available to help public water suppliers that discover PFAS contamination. Are you there, Maria?
Thank you, Lydia. Yes, I'm here.
Great.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, good morning. My name is Mwra. I am the Director of the Division of Municipal Services at MassDEP. My division oversees the projects that are funded through the State Revolving Fund Program, or SRF for short. SRF offers subsidized loans to communities across the Commonwealth for the construction or necessary upgrades of critical drinking water or wastewater infrastructure. I do not see my presentation on this. Oh, there it is. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't see it. Thank you. The SRF program is jointly administered by MassDEP and the Massachusetts Clean Water Trust. MassDEP oversees the projects and the Clean Water Trust manages the funds. Today, I will give a brief overview on how to access SRF financing through the Drinking Water SRF. To fund the program, Massachusetts receives a grant from EPA of about $25 million annually, plus the state upfronts a 20% match to the grant. In addition, all the repayments allow the funds to grow, and this continues to grow over time. Massachusetts utilizes a leverage model approach for that means that for every dollar invested in the program, the SRF program provides $3 in project financing. This has allowed the program to offer approximately $150 million annually for high priority drinking water projects. Addressing PFAS in drinking water is a top priority for Massachusetts. To this end, in its fiscal year 2019 closeout budget, Massachusetts authorized an operating transfer of over $10 million to the Clean Water Trust for the remediation of PFAS in drinking water, and also an additional $9 million were transferred to increase program capacity. These funds have made it possible for the trust to offer 0% interest loans for projects that remove PFAS from drinking water. This program will continue to be offered indefinitely until the funds run out. Next slide, please. There are two mechanisms for accessing the SRF financing. The standard process is by participating in the annual project solicitation and making it into the intended use plan. The intended use plan describes all the available funding, all the projects that are being offered financing, and these are listed by priority ranking. And the IUP undergoes a very robust public review and comment process, including a public hearing. The vast majority of projects that are financed through the SRF program go through this process. The SRF program has a set of deadlines that are established to meet EPA grant commitments. Therefore, it is imperative that once a project appearing on the IUP, it must be ready to proceed. Here on the slide, I have listed some of the more significant deadlines. The first one is the annual solicitation, which opens in July of each year, and the deadline to submit a proposal is in mid-August. MassDEP then reviews all the proposals and ranks them by priority based on the impacts to public health and also the benefits that the project offers, and it develops the intended use plan. The plan is usually published early in the IUP year. The application to submit, the deadline to submit the loan application is in mid-October of the IUP year, but the critical deadline that I would like to highlight is the authorization to borrow that must be obtained by June 30th of that year. And then also having all the required documentations and permits. I have listed here the link of the information where the applications can be found. Next slide, please. The second way to access financing is by requesting emergency financing. This option is available only for an anticipated and acute public health concerns that arise and need immediate attention. For example, if a public water supply has concentrations of over 20 parts per trillion of PFAS, and there are no other options to meet the water supply needs, then the provider could solicit financing to, for instance, install carbon filters. This would be an emergency situation. Construction of a brand new treatment plant would not be consistent with an emergency. That would have to go through the standard IUP process. To apply, the potential borrower needs to submit a request to my attention, and I have my email listed there, describing the situation on the public health concerns and the need to act immediately, including laboratory test results, a cost estimate, and a schedule of the proposed project, and the commitment to seek expeditiously the local authorization to borrow. After reviewing that information, and I would consult also with the regional office and the drinking water program, then if the situation merits an emergency application, then the borrower can proceed to apply for the loan. That concludes my presentation. I'll take any questions if there are any.
Maria, you have not received any questions yet. Maybe they'll come in after.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Maria. And with that, I will then invite Paul Locke, our Assistant Commissioner for the Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup, to talk a little bit about PFAS and source discovery through the Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup.
Hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. My light just turned green. Well, good morning, and thank you for inviting me to today's seminar. My name is Paul Locke, and I'm the Assistant Commissioner for the Waste Site Cleanup Program, and I'm based in Boston. The Waste Site Cleanup Program directs the notification, assessment, cleanup, and closeout of sites where that are contaminated with oil and hazardous material that have been released to the environment. So usually we find out about these sites through a variety of different means. Today, we're talking specifically about the kinds of sites that we find out about because a public water supply has been sampling for and has discovered PFAS in the water supply. So before I get into any more detail, I want to stress that there is a notification in our waste site cleanup regulations specifically for water suppliers doing sampling under the drinking water program. We treat the water suppliers essentially as down gradient recipients of other people's contamination, and we try to keep them out of the waste site cleanup program itself. The water suppliers deal directly with our sister program, the drinking water program, and we certainly understand that you guys have your hands full dealing with the results of the PFAS sampling. So what we do in the waste site cleanup program is working with our drinking water program colleagues, begin working out from this information that we have that the water supplier has discovered PFAS in its water supply, and we try to answer the question of where is it coming from and what can be done about it beyond the water supplier. One of the things we're concerned about is the possibility of private wells in the area also being contaminated, so we'll begin looking at that to see if they need to be sampled and working with the homeowners to do that. And then following the contamination as we find it, working both up and down gradient until hopefully we find the potential source of that contamination. In addition to the field work that we're doing, we also have the ability to send out requests for information to local industries or other potential sources of contamination that might be in the area to find out about the kinds of chemicals they use, the processes they use, and their waste disposal practices. When we feel confident that we have enough information to identify the potential sources, we would issue them notices of responsibility, NORs, and they're the folks that we would then bring into the waste site cleanup program to pick up the assessment and cleanup process. Typically, we've worked, as it specifically concerns PFAS, we've worked with US EPA. The Department of Defense has been the responsible party for a number of the sites that we've been working on. And there are other industries in municipal organizations like firefighting units and the like, where they are the sources of contamination. We're working with them to deal with the resulting groundwater plumes. Next slide, please. One thing I would point out is that the waste site cleanup program is a semi-privatized system. We generally the DEP staff do not generally oversee directly the work that's being done, although, admittedly for PFAS sites, we spend a lot of time working on these sites as well. But the responsible party is required to hire a licensed site professional, and there are about 500 of those LSPs in Massachusetts that have the experience working with our regulations and the experience doing this work. And we will work with the water suppliers and the communities and the responsible parties and the LSPs to make sure that the necessary work is done. The types of sources of contamination that we've seen so far are airfields, particularly Department of Defense facilities, some industries, and as I mentioned before, fire training facilities. So we're working closely with our drinking water program folks In the ideal situation, we will help them and help you find the source of contamination. And in the best possible worlds, and we have some success so far in some situations, find responsible parties who will be able to contribute financially in the treatment of the public water supply, as well as do the assessment and cleanup necessary at the source area. And be happy to take any questions you may have, either now or sometime in the future. You can always send email either to me directly. I think there's contacts, but also at email to bwsc.information@mass.gov is also an easy way to contact us.
And Paul, no questions came in while you were speaking, but maybe you'll have some later.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. With that, I wanted to highlight the MassDEP efforts by showing you our website. Apologies. If you go to the MassDEP PFAS webpage, you can see there are many resources available, a lot of information about PFAS, and information for public water suppliers. But the part I was going to highlight here is this story map on the webpage that talks about all of the things that Massachusetts has been doing to address PFAS contamination. There's tabs along here on the left, talks a little bit about what PFAS are, why they're important. You guys can see this, the story map currently, right? I hope.
Yep.
Okay, good, great. And so there's information about testing for PFAS. There's information about the free testing program, and there's a map of the towns throughout the Commonwealth, and shows where some of the public water suppliers have already tested for PFAS. There's both a list of the ones going through the free sampling program, as well as water suppliers that have tested on their own. You can click on a town, and it says how many water suppliers there are in the town and how many have tested. And it also provides information about whether or not it's an environmental justice town. And you can see there's other information about how many have at least commenced testing through the program or otherwise. And then there is a map of the drinking water systems that have detected PFAS so far. Hopefully this is going to be updated with an interactive map soon. And there's a link there to a table of what some of the response actions have been for those public water suppliers that have detected PFAS over 20 parts per trillion. There's a little information about treating drinking water for PFAS. There's information about the PFAS treatment design grants. There have been 2 rounds of grants now. The first have been awarded, so you can see on the map the public water suppliers that had funds awarded through the PFAS treatment design grant program. If you click on the dots, you can learn about which PWSs were given grants and what the treatment design grant was for. And there's also a list of them on the right, so you can learn more about them by clicking on them over there. And then the second round of PFAS design treatment grants are currently in process. Those applications were due at the end of last year, and the program is hoping to make awards in February, I believe. And then last but not least is a map of construction projects that have been funded by the SRF that Maria spoke about, the State Revolving Fund. And again, there's a list of projects that have been funded, and one can click on them and learn a little bit more about the project and what that money is being used for. But again, this is just one of many resources on our webpage. I wanted to point it out for you guys because it is a good way to see what is being done about PFAS in Massachusetts, thanks to various MassDEP efforts and the works of the public water suppliers who have participated in those. Lastly, there's a list of resources here. This list of resources will also go out in the materials that are mailed after class in a form where they can be clicked on so that folks can learn more. Many of these resources are available on that MassDEP PFAS page. If you just Google MassDEP PFAS, you can see all those resources, including things like the story map, but also a handy flyer on how to interpret PFAS lab results, which goes through some of those things that Bill talked about, and lots of other resources. So when people have questions, they should feel free to email the program director at -DWP email address that's here. They also, there's often questions and answers provided online. There may be more coming out in those bi-weekly emails from the program director, including things like some of the questions may be asked today. We can draft up some of the answers and share them with other water suppliers as well. And then we are up to our, I believe, final quiz. And the question is, the quarterly average PFAS, oh, I think I skipped a quiz, so I'm going to do the one that's on the screen. Care must be taken when collecting PFAS samples of drinking water. Nope, sorry. Our helpers are probably bringing up the next quiz, which is,
Yep.
There we go. If the quarterly average PFAS 6 concentration at an entry point is more than 20 nanograms per liter, public notice is required. And then the options are true or false.
We're almost what we got before. Okay, about 85%. We'll give folks about 5 more seconds and we'll shut down the poll. And 96% of the people said true.
Excellent. Folks are paying attention, asking the good questions, and answering quiz questions correctly. And then we're going to transition directly into a poll, which is, have you seen the movie Dark Waters about PFAS contamination in West Virginia? And the answers are yes or no.
Okay, we've most of our votes. We'll give people 5 more seconds and then we will close the poll.
And I will confess that I have not seen the movie, although I have read a fair bit about the situation, and it is a pretty interesting story about persistence and trying to.
Well, looks like you're with the majority, Lydia. 86% of people have not seen it either.
All right, I hear it's quite a good movie, and certainly the situation was a really interesting one. So I'm hoping to get to it one of these days.
Lydia, do you know where that movie is on? Is it a Netflix thing, or how do you find it?
It was a major picture release, so I'm guessing if you search to see which services have it now, you could hopefully find it on some of them at least. So. All right, and then that concludes my section with our special guests. So if folks have questions in the chat box, we can start to answer them.
All right, we had a couple back here. Okay, if you tell customers to use bottled water, how can you be sure that the bottled water is below that 20 parts per trillion?
There is a link in the template of the public education materials and the public notice to a list on the MassDEP Drinking Water Program website that shows the bottled water suppliers that voluntarily tested for PFAS and did not find PFAS in their water. Our hope is to eventually get the Department of Public Health to provide more information from the testing that's being done now as well. But at least we have that list of water suppliers who have tested for PFAS and providing bottled water that did not have PFAS.
And I know there was a question here. I can't find it right now. Did we include that link in our materials? The public education link, Lydia?
I don't know that the link to the bottled water suppliers is in that.
We can,
Yes,
we can add it. Someone.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll come to the question in a minute. It was something like that. And then speaking of bottled water, on that website, will you find regulations, or what are the regulations for bottled water on PFAS?
Bottled water is regulated as a food by the Department of Public Health, but they require that those who sell bottled water in Massachusetts sample, I believe, once a year, and they are using that same 20 parts per trillion for PFAS 6.
Okay. Oh, here's the question. It said I could not find the PFAS public education form online. Is that same one that we were just talking about, or is that a different one?
Well, the templates, as they were being finalized, were being provided by the regional contacts. I believe we hope to get them on the web soon.
Okay, so there's not even a link to share yet.
No.
Okay, that was the question that I was mixing with the other one. Okay. Why would DEP allow the spreading of human sludge on farms with PFAS? Couldn't or wouldn't DEP want to pause this program, or shouldn't DEP pause this program?
I believe the Bureau of Water has been moving very quickly to sample to see if they're finding PFAS at levels of concern, and are accelerating the amount of monitoring that would need to happen so that they could be sure that they were not spreading sludge that would be impacting the groundwater.
What happens if a PWS has PFAS 6 over 20 from the only supply and cannot meet any of the short-term solutions?
I believe there are systems that have been looking to either make interconnections or provide bottled water for sensitive subpopulations. Otherwise, the public education and public notice requirements would be going forward to at least inform the population about the water that they are drinking.
Are fire departments being asked to use a FFF alternative?
There has been that buyback program, and I believe there has been a move by fire officials in the state to encourage the use of non-PFAS firefighting AFFF.
Okay. In rural areas of Massachusetts where there has been a known fire extinguished with foam, would those private wells take priority to be tested for PFAS?
They would certainly be in the group if we learned about them from the local Board of Health or other. We invite fire chiefs to meetings. If we learned about such a situation, they would certainly be in the invitations that we would send out, yes.
Depending on the PFAS plumes and location to a public drinking water supply, can the timeline be given on the MCP to be shortened? I'm sorry, that came out a little funky. That's how it was written. In the timeline on the MCP be shortened?
So this is Paul Locke from the Wayside Cleanup Program. So what I think is being asked has to do with the timelines for the kind of assessment process and cleanup under the MCP, and the kind of one of the kind of features that we have in the MCP is when public or private water supplies are affected by contamination at a site, that triggers immediate response actions, or IRAs, that speeds up the timelines for everything. So where there is in fact an impact to a drinking water source, whether it's public or private, the timeline should be sped up.
Thank you. If you are contracted by a town to operate their PWS, are we still eligible, or must the town apply for the grant?
I guess it would depend on which grants they're speaking about. I believe for the PFAS treatment design grants, those were for municipalities, and so it would be the town that would have to apply. Margaret, do you have a better answer for that?
Oh, the public water suppliers were supposed to apply that. Hopefully there'll be more grants in the future, but that depends on the legislature. We've given out 2 million already, and we're gonna give out another 3 million to the ones that applied by the end of last year.
And so I'd like to just comment, that's to do with the grants, the free analysis. I think the contract operator can still apply for.
Yes.
I'll set with that one. Okay, this question is for Maria. You said funding, you said there's funding for treatment, but is there funding for an entire treatment plant?
Are you unmuted, Maria?
If Maria's gone, I can answer that. Yes, you can apply for the 0% interest loan for a whole treatment plan. That just doesn't qualify for the emergency loan. That would be through the usual process where you apply in August.
Just catching up with the questions here. In the CCR, do detects of raw water wells need to be reported, or is it only finished water sample results that need to be reported?
It's the finished water.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say we'll double check on that as well, but I think the finished water, because that's what's being regulated.
Correct.
Does the PFAS 6 refer to the 6 compounds that are starred?
Yes. In the slide that I had that they were starred, it is those 6.
Okay. Before I test for PFAS, do I need to set up an account with DEP?
The free sampling, you would need to request it if that's the account you're talking about. If you're just sampling, no. If you're just sampling on your own, no. But if you're requesting free analysis, there needs to be some contact made with either the regional PFAS lead or the UMass contract specific person that is working with us on that.
And if it's speaking to the lab results, the labs will be reporting using EDP soon. So the account doesn't, the public water supplier doesn't need to be created before then, but it'll be helpful for the public water supplier to get one soon so they can look at the results there.
If sludge from wastewater plants are air dried, wouldn't that aerosolize, I'm not sure what the right word there is, the PFAS and contaminate the area around and the groundwater nearby?
So I'll attempt to answer that. PFAS isn't volatile, so it's not just going to escape into the air. And if it is in the drinking water residuals, there is testing that's required for drinking water residuals, as well as I believe there's some guidelines with the lagoons that the residuals sit in, where they may need to have a layer underneath them that doesn't allow it to penetrate through. But I would say, yeah, there are some concerns with the residuals as far as if there's PFAS in the source water, there may be PFAS in the residuals.
Okay. Can household faucet filters remove PFAS?
If a filter includes carbon, it could. There are point of entry and point of use home systems that are designed to remove PFAS. There's information on the MassDEP Drinking Water Program treatment page about removing PFAS with home systems.
Is there any data showing that changing out new activated carbon in a treatment plant shows very good results or just better results?
So I don't, I do have a situation in the Southeast region where someone changed out GAC and the results went from over 20 to non-detect. I do just want to preface that with that site specific. I don't know that it's going to happen at every situation, but it did happen at one PWS. It may even be more. Yeah, one PWS in Zero did do that, and there was a good, result.
Is there a list of fire departments that have participated in the AFFF buyback program?
There's a report on our webpage, the results of that buyback program. I don't know if there's information in there about the particular fire departments. I know they did it in conjunction with the Massachusetts State Fire Chief. So check that out, and there's probably contact information.
Okay. Have bottled water companies tested their sources only or after water has been bottled for an extended period of time?
I don't know that we know the answer to that one. I think there have been studies of both, but in Massachusetts, I would imagine they're testing their source waters.
That was a tough one. The DuPont PFAS incident came out years ago. It has been proven how harmful PFAS can be. Why does it take so long for us to get these regulations to be set? It's been 20 years or so since it has come out.
So, my thought on that is, or my comment on that is Massachusetts is ahead of EPA and some of the other states are ahead of EPA. So I think we're being proactive.
Yeah, this is Paul Locke. I would put a couple more things in perspective. It's first, there's been a lot of information about the toxicity of PFAS compounds going back a number of years. A lot of that, as if you watch the Dark Waters movie, focus around the plants where these materials are manufactured and the health effects to the workers who are exposed during the manufacturing process. And the reason I bring that up is at that point, you're talking about exposures that are orders of magnitude greater than what we're talking about here for drinking water. It's only, even as recently as UCMR 3, the detection limits for PFAS in drinking water were closer to the 70 parts per trillion number, and we were not able to even see the lower levels that we're now concerned about. So while there has been information going back quite a while, it is really only recently that we've had the ability to measure lower levels and the ability to see potential health effects at those levels. So the timeline for kind of where you start and kind of how quickly the department and EPA and others have acted really goes back to the UCMR 3 program, where we had the ability to look at these low levels in the environmental media.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And someone made a correction. They did look on Netflix for Dark Waters. It's no longer available. So you may have to do some research on how to find it. Lydia, would you just advance the slide so we can see the contact information of everybody while we're sitting here? Thank you. Would a J value of 1.2 be considered non-detect since it's below the 2.0 MRL?
Yes. For PFAS 6.
Okay.
Correct. The only thing I do want to comment on is each analysis in lab method can have a varying MRL, so it's not always 2.0. We require it has to be, no more than 2.0 or less than 2.0. Some MRLs are 1.8, or I've seen 1.8 and other things, so it isn't always 2.0. I just wanted to make that clear.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah.
Is PFAS still in foam that a Massachusetts fire department would buy?
This is Paul Locke again. I'll take that. In talking about PFAS and AFFF, I wouldn't generalize to PFAS. There has been a ban on using the longer chain, 6, 7, 8 carbon chain PFAS compounds in manufacturing, including in AFFF. So when we talk about the foam that is of most concern that we took back in the take back program, it is that the legacy foam is the way we refer to it, the older foam with the longer carbon chain substances. That being said, even the newer, quote, better foam at the moment does still have the shorter chain PFAS compounds as part of the formula. There's a lot of work being done to find formulations that would eliminate even those short chain PFAS compounds. But there's this balance that the firefighting community and the Department of Defense, who is leading this effort, and others have on the effectiveness of the foam to address potentially catastrophic fire incidents and the concerns about PFAS. So there still continues to be PFAS, but it's the shorter ones, and people are working to eliminate those.
Okay, we are part of a combined system, and we were told that because we are combined, we do not qualify for the free testing of our wells. Can you explain what the reason for that is?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, Rebecca?
We are part of a combined system, and we are told because we are combined, we do not qualify for the free testing of our wells. What is the reason?
So if they're a consecutive system, meaning they purchase finished water from another PWS, that PWS is required to sample for PFAS. And so the consecutive system doesn't need to sample or isn't required to sample for water that the provider is sampling for, if I explain that correctly. So it is if you're a consecutive system, it's getting sampled from the PWS that's providing you that water should be sampling that water, and so thus you would not need to sample it.
Okay. Are there known concentrations being deposited from other areas, industries, smoke emissions only?
I don't think we know of air permits for PFAS in Massachusetts.
There are no air permits specifically. If the question is more whether we know that air deposition is a one potential source of PFAS, then we have a couple pieces of evidence, and there's probably more but one is that there has been some limited sampling of rain precipitation, and that has shown low levels, typically I think less than 3 parts per trillion, but measurable in some rain samples, which indicates would indicate, I think, potential air sources. And also, we in Wayside Cleanup have made use of work that Vermont has done in sampling surficial soil for PFAS compounds across the state. They did an excellent background study and found, again, measurable levels of PFAS widespread in surficial soil across Vermont. And the implication to that is the PFAS that they were finding is likely to at least have some significant contribution from air deposition of PFAS.
How will sludge decant water that drains back to a reservoir be handled under this requirement?
Well, so I don't know that I can thoroughly answer that. I would say, ultimately, if the source water has PFAS, the water going back to the reservoir through a NIPD's permit, I believe, is what it would be, would probably need to be sampled for PFAS. I mean, you could be repeating that cycle if you're discharging, if the source water has PFAS and then you're discharging the water back into the reservoir. That could be taking place.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, they are looking to step up the sampling for NIPD's and surface water. I believe that's actually more accelerated for areas that could be impacting a public water supply as well.
How is the activated carbon filtration spoils for PFAS disposed of, and is it costly?
I don't know of the exact cost. There is a cost associated with it. Some of the PWSs in the Southeast region are having their activated carbon regenerated and they can reuse it. But there is definitely a cost associated with, that treatment and disposing of or reusing the GAC.
Is there a timeline to eliminate all PFAS compounds in all manufacturing?
I don't know of one. It's the sort of thing that would require national, if not international, action, I imagine, because PFAS are used in many countries.
Okay. I see a couple comments that Dark Waters is available through Amazon Prime, Hulu, and others. For a PWS such as a campground that maintains fire extinguishers, what specifically could or should we do to ensure our extinguishers are utilizing chemicals with the least PFAS impact?
My understanding. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Paul Locke, I don't believe that fire extinguishers typically would have AFFF PFAS compounds in them. You might want to check specifically to make sure, but on the particular manufacturer. But in general, the PFAS AFFF is kind of the gold standard of firefighting foam, and even firefighters, because of its cost, tend to use it for very specific purposes in limited situations.
Okay. Can you repeat what someone said about the labs? Can labs sub out the PFAS work?
Labs that are not certified by MassDEP can subcontract to labs that are certified by MassDEP. That was just, that's, I do know some PWSs like staying with certain labs. They have a good relationship, and they use them for a wide variety of things, but they may not be certified. And so I've got that question before, so I thought it was important to put in the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hi, Bill. This is Andrew. The tricky thing is, it's allowed, but there will be the requirement to report on EDEP. So once EDEP is up and running, if the lab you're using isn't capable of reporting on EDEP, that lab may have to work out some agreement to have the PFAS lab do the upload for them. So it does get a little sticky, but it can be done.
Do I have to collect samples from the raw water intake or just the entry points only?
So that's site specific. If you initially just detect if you initially just sample the entry point and there's a detect, if that entry point is fed by multiple raw water sources, you want to sample each individual raw water source so you can see the contributing factor of PFAS from each one. And then also, if you have any existing PFAS or treatment that would remove PFAS, GAC, reverse osmosis, or resins, we're looking to have the source sampled so that we know what is in the source prior to treatment.
How are water systems paying for treatment systems? Are there grants available for the treatment infrastructure?
Well, on the story map, as I showed, there are a good number of systems that have used that SRF funding that Maria spoke about to install treatment.
How much money or relatively how much money are each tests? It also asks what will the cost be to the system, but I think they're more asking, about how much are these lab tests.
I haven't seen it. I think what we've heard is $300 to $400 a sample.
Okay, I see a comment in the chat box that says 200 to 300. So
Okay.
yeah, that's someone else says a range of 200 to 400. So
and that again is the reason to, promote or plug the free analysis.
okay. Let's do one more question. What happens if you retest and get a higher value? Do you then do a retest of the retest?
No, as long as so we typically don't use, retest isn't a term that we typically use, but if if the results of any test pass QA/QC, well, I guess I'm kind of jumping ahead here. If the value's higher, as long as they pass QA, QC, there's no reason to retest. The samples are good.
Okay. I think that's time. Lydia, back to you for a few comments, unless anybody else has any other comments they'd like to add.
All right, well, that takes us to our final slide, which is a thank you from us for all the really good questions that everyone had. Thank you from those of us who did the presentation. I apologize. I see here that I have Kathy Wannett where Bill should be. Bill did a great job. Apologies, Bill. We wanted to thank you guys all for coming in today, asking really good questions, participating. I wanted to thank our special guest presenters, Paul Locke. Those were really great answers in the question and answer, much appreciated, and we appreciated you joining us. Maria Pinode, thank you for the adding the information about the SRF funding, and thank you to Andrew Durham for doing the big walkthrough on the EDP. And thanks to RCAP for hosting and helping it run smoothly.
Great.
I guess I should mention that again, that we hope to get a video of this presentation up onto the MassDEP website within a couple weeks, or I think we even said maybe within a week. And there is a video of a previous version of this presentation available on the MassDEP YouTube website as well. We will send out more materials after the course is over as well. So back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Lydia. So I just want to let you guys know who are trying to earn TCHs, as long as you meet our requirements, which means you were in the class for a good amount of time, answered 75% of the polls or tests, and then I know a couple of you had problems and you were restarting your computer. It's okay if you missed one or two, that's fine. We got your comments anyways. And complete your evaluation. As long as you complete all those 3 things, you'll get your certificate by email, the email that you're registered with. Email and let me know if that is not going to work. The evaluation, this is going to pop up in a new browser after you exit. So make sure that you're not looking for anything, but the second you hit that exit button or we end the session, a new browser window is going to pop up. That's where your evaluation is going to be. If you happen to miss it or something happens, no problem. It's going to be sent to you in a follow-up email. You'll get that email tomorrow morning. That email will have the link to the evaluation. Please complete that as soon as you can. Tomorrow would be the best, or today. And along in that email are going to be all the materials that we mentioned today. Some links, some materials, a copy of the presentation. All those things will be in your follow-up email.